On this episode of Skeptiko, Greta Christina joins Alex for a debate on the existence of the soul.
What you said is fine, but Greta, you got to back it up. You're saying that every time somebody gives you research, you go and look at it and it's debunked. Well, tell me what's been debunked. You haven't cited any real NDE research. You studied Keith Augustine, and then you want to cite Skeptical Inquirer and Skeptical Magazine. Those aren't peer-reviewed journals.
Even if I conceded everything that you'd said in this whole conversation, all that it proves is that consciousness is weird and that we don't understand it. It doesn't prove anything about there being an immaterial soul that animates consciousness, and it doesn't prove anything about that immaterial soul surviving death.
Stay with us for Skeptiko.
Welcome to Skeptiko, where we explore controversial science with leading researchers, thinkers, and their critics. I'm your host, Alex Tsakiris, and for a while on this show, I've maintained that there really isn't a good, solid scientific argument against near-death experience science. I mean, if you've followed this show and you've listened to the guests that we've had on, people like Dr. Jeffrey Long, Dr. Pin van Lommel, Dr. Peter Fennick, Dr. Bruce Grayson, who we haven't actually interviewed but has contributed via email. If you listen to those people and you stack them up against the skeptics who we've talked to, Dr. G.M. Worley or Dr. Kevin Nelson, Dr. Susan Blackmore, Dr. Stephen Novella, or even Dr. Sam Parnia, who's kind of in the middle of this issue, but we really have to put on the side of a skeptic. If you stack up the two arguments, there's really no comparison. The skeptical arguments against near-death experience science really amount to nothing more than apologetics, where folks are starting with an end conclusion that this is the way it has to be, and then working backwards to try and fit the data, and winding up in a position that just says, don't give up hope, we can still hold out that someday will be proven true. Now, this is most evident by the fact that there just isn't any NDE research that these skeptics can point to support their position. There isn't any. The little bit that's out there, for example, Kevin Nelson from the University of Kentucky, well, we had him on the show, and I think Dr. Jeffrey Long just pretty well tore apart his ideas about this being some kind of sleep state that we're talking about. Same goes with Dr. Jerry Worley and Dr. Stephen Novella, neither of whom have really published any NDE research. They've just pointed to others and kind of compiled it and said, oh, it's there, it's there, it's there. But when you really dig into the research that they're pointing to, as we have done in this show, it isn't there. In fact, if you remember when Stephen Novella was on the show, the couple of bits of research that he pointed to really gave support to the other side of the claim. That is that these NDEs are medically inexplicable. So what we have here is a lot of apologetics, a lot of cognitive dissonance where, hey, I don't really want to change my belief, so I'll come up with anything that lets me hold on to my position. But then again, that's just my opinion. It's not like the debate is over. There's plenty of people out there who still hold on to the skeptical position I'm talking about. And that's what today's show is about. So joining me for this debate is blogger Greta Christina, whose recent article, Near-Death Experiences Are a Terrible Argument for the Soul, directly addresses so many of the points that we want to talk about. And I have to say, I think Greta does a great job of representing the skeptical/atheist position on near-death experience, especially since, as she admits, she's not a researcher.
I'm not a neurologist, I'm not a neuropsychologist, I'm not any kind of medical researcher or scientist or anything like that. Essentially what I am is a smart layperson who's studied this a lot.
So I appreciate Greta joining me for this debate, and I particularly appreciate that Greta didn't resort to some of the usual things of just either denying the data or offering some unbelievable explanation of why blind people should regain sight during near-death experience. She doesn't do any of that. She pretty much sticks to, well, wait, maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's get into my debate with Greta Christina around the question of whether or not NDE science proves the existence of the soul. Now, here's how we tackled it. I broke the debate down into 6 questions. Now, in this episode, I'm going to go over each of the 6 questions we talked about. You're going to hear some of my points, you're going to hear some of Greta's points, and you're going to hear some of the other research that I referenced during the show. Now, what I really hope is that this debate and this show is really the first part of an ongoing process that we can have, I can have with you, those folks who've connected to this show, and that we can have an ongoing discussion about these 6 points, and we can really hash them out. And you can bring any new information that I might have missed or that Greta might have missed, and we can really turn this into an organic, ongoing debate. At least that's my hope at this point, but I guess we'll see how that goes. To get there, we have to start. So let's go to the first question. Does survival of consciousness mean the same thing as existence of the soul? Well, this is really kind of a definitional point here, but Greta and I agreed that, at least for the sake of this discussion, we're really talking about the same thing.
Sure, yeah. I think, of course, one of the issues that I have with a lot of religious and spiritual beliefs and experiences is that these terms aren't defined very well and aren't defined very clearly. And I think if you ask 100 different people, what do you mean by the soul, you're probably going to get 100 different answers. But for the moment, I will definitely say that essentially what most people mean is that some sort of consciousness or identity is preserved after the physical body dies.
Now, question 2 has to do with what is consciousness? Now, of course, that's a huge, huge question. But what we really try to do is hone in on the fact that consciousness is not well understood by science at this point, and that while we know there's a strong link between the mind and the brain, there also seems to be some anomalous data that suggests that maybe the link isn't the way that we think. Maybe the brain is more of a transceiver for this thing called consciousness. So we wound up more or less agreeing that there's a gap in our scientific understanding about consciousness.
Well, here's what I would say to that. I mean, it's certainly the case that the sciences studying consciousness are very much in their infancy. The science of neurology, the science of neuropsychology, we're beginning to get a grasp of consciousness, but just in the very beginning. We're just building the foundation of really understanding what consciousness is. I obviously agree with you that we do know that there is a very intimate connection between the physical brain and consciousness. You make changes to the brain, consciousness changes. We can see that using functional magnetic resonance imagery, and you can see it the other way too. If you ask people to think about certain things, you can see those changes happening in the brain. So changes in the brain affect changes in consciousness. Changes in consciousness make changes in the brain. We know that. There's not any doubt about that. So the question is there anything else going on in addition to that? Is there any other process? Is there any other, metaphysical, supernatural, spiritual, whatever you want to call it, soul, we talked about, that's affecting the process in addition to that?
Now, question 3 in this debate about whether NDE science is proof of the existence of a soul, the question I asked was, is NDE science a good way of looking at the hard problem of consciousness? The hard problem being, is the mind separate from the brain? And this turned out to be a little bit more controversial than I thought. To me, it's pretty obvious that if we're studying this mind-brain duality thing, and is the mind separate from the brain, that we could look at a number of different things. We could look at telepathy. We could look at precognition. We could look at global consciousness, all topics which we've covered extensively on this show. We could also look at psychic medium communication, deathbed communication, again, topics we've talked about. But to me, near-death experience science has some unique benefits. In particular, the fact that it's medical science, it brings it down to a level that we can understand and really wrap our arms around. And the fact that it deals with death, that is the end of consciousness, allows us some real key insights into some fundamental questions about consciousness. But Greta's take was slightly different.
If what you're asking is, are near-death experiences an interesting and fruitful area to look at when you're talking about this question? Sure, I wouldn't disagree with that. I think that there's a lot of other very fruitful areas.
I just focus on the fact that it's about dying and it's about death.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
soul is,
sure.
So you prove telepathy, you can come up with some different explanations, but there's some kind of physiological or biological, link to that. Versus death, we're really kind of entering a different domain. But we've
actually, you know what? There's actually something I do want to respond to that, because I think it's actually not a small point. I think it's a sort of one of the cruxes of the points that I want to make, which is that near-death experiences are not death. And I think that that's one of the points that a lot of people who advocate that near-death experiences are evidence of a soul are missing, that there is a significant difference between being near death. That doesn't necessarily tell you what's true about death. Near death it's another state of still being alive. It's a state of altered consciousness.
I don't think that you would really get agreement from most people who are medical experts in studying death or near death. I interviewed recently Dr. Sam Parnia, who is a physician in the UK who's doing probably the largest study of near-death experience, but his real expertise is in working with patients who are near death, regardless of whether they experience an NDE or not. And he's really somewhat of a skeptic, as we explored on this show, but he's just a hard-nosed doctor who works every day in the ICU unit. And what he is particularly keen on defining and helping people understand, he says, if you have a cardiac arrest, you are dead. As far as we medically define it, if you have cardiac arrest, you are dead. Now, as to whether or not we can resuscitate you, whether or not we can bring you back to life, that's another question. But it's pretty clear from what we know medically. When your heart stops, within 10 to 15 seconds, your brain shuts down. There is no electrical activity. And within a couple of minutes, your brain starts to decay and the process becomes irreversible. So I'm not sure that I would really agree with you that there's this issue in terms of near death. Certainly there is if we look at, someone who's drowning, where the death process can drag out for a long period of time. But if we focus on certain medical conditions, particularly cardiac arrest, you're dead.
Actually, I don't agree with that at all. And in fact, again, my wife is a nurse practitioner. A lot of people I know are medical people, and a lot of the research that I've read about this is from medical people, and I don't think there's any such agreement that that's what death means. I mean, cardiac arrest, and for one thing, if we're talking about consciousness, I don't think we think that consciousness lives in the heart. The heart is a muscle that pumps blood.
Certainly, I wasn't suggesting that when your heart stops, you die. What I was saying is that when your heart stops, we know medically, physiologically, that within a very short period of time, 10 to 15, maybe 20 seconds at the tops, your brain stops.
I wish we would stop talking about the cardiac arrest, because I'm not sure why that's relevant. Why don't we just talk about the EEG? Why don't we just talk about flatlining?
Okay, just to clarify, part of the reason I was talking about the cardiac arrest is because the best research that's been done in near-death experience, but certainly not the only research, has been done in cardiac wards, because they saw the same problem. They saw, hey, we have these near-death experience accounts, and some are coming from people who jump off a building and have a near-death experience. Other are from people who are drowning. Other are people who are frozen to death. So these are all very medically different processes in terms of how they're dying and shutting down, versus if we confine our discussion to cardiac arrest patients, there we have a much clearer understanding of what's happening inside their brain, even if they're not hooked up to an EEG. So we're in agreement that if you have a flat EEG, then you shouldn't have a conscious experience.
That certainly seems likely. Again, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a medical researcher, I'm not a neurologist, but that certainly seems likely.
Okay, so we wrestled that one to the ground. NDE science is a good way of studying consciousness. The next question, question 4, is there really an NDE phenomena? Turned out to be less controversial. Let me then jump back to a point that I wanted to make. And again, you've said this much in your post, so I don't think we have any disagreement, but let's nail it down. And that's that these near-death experiences, they are happening. I mean, we have them in all the medical journals, the New England Journal of Medicine, the Lancet. I mean, every medical journal you can think of has published. So we know these things are happening, and we have considerable.
I want to make sure we're talking about the same thing. When you say these things, what exact experiences? Because a lot of times I found that when people talk about near-death experiences, we're not always talking about the same thing. So I want you to define your terms. What exactly, basically, are you saying that sometimes when people are near death, they have these sort of altered states of consciousness? They feel like they're going down a tunnel or towards a bright light. They feel like they're, they have this experience of seeing people they know. They have experiences of seeing religious figures like Jesus or Buddha or the Hindu gods or whatever, depending on what their religious beliefs are. Is that what we're talking about?
Yes. As a matter of fact, there's a scale that's been developed by one of the leading researchers named Bruce Grayson from University of Virginia, and that's commonly used in these research studies. It's called the Grayson Scale, and it's 7 questions that they ask, and many of them are the ones that you just asked. Did you have consciousness during this time when you were near death? Did you experience other relatives? Did you have any of these other experiences? And depending on how they answer that, we can rate how deep, if you will, their near-death experience was. So, yeah, it sounds like we're talking about the same body of research. Now on to the last 2 questions that really get to the heart of the debate about NDE science. Question 5 is the near-death experience phenomena medically inexplicable?
Actually, I don't agree with that at all. All the research that I've shown shows that it's an unusual experience, but it's really just an altered state of consciousness. It's not medically inexplicable. So that's the first point I want to make. So first of all, I don't think it's medically inexplicable. But part of the problem with studying NDEs is that memory is strange, and people will say, oh, yes, I had this memory of experience at this particular time, and they'll say that it was at the time that they were flatlining, but they don't really know that they were flatlined. They don't, and so the whole question of, trying to determine was somebody conscious at the moment that they were flatlined, I don't know of any research that shows that. I don't know how you would even test that because...
Hold on, but let me stop you. Let me stop you there, Greta, because we can really hone in on some of the points, and maybe this will work or maybe it won't. But what you just said is, how would you even test for that was your second point. And the first point was you're not sure that there's any studies out there that do. Let's start with the second way of how you would test for that. One, the anecdotal evidence, which has generated further research, not anecdotal, but prospective research, was that people can recall things during a time when we can assume that their EEG was flat. So again...
And that's what I don't agree with you about. People seem to recall. No, okay, I'm sorry, but it's just that I'm
going to get to that. I'm going to get to exactly your point of seeming to recall. Okay, but so just to recap, I was going to say, and that's why we do this cardiac arrest thing, is because if they have a cardiac arrest, we can assume that their EEG is flat, even if they're not hooked up to an EEG monitor. If after 30 seconds after cardiac arrest, we can assume their EEG is flat. So here's how they do that. And here's the best research, and it's been done several different times. But the person that we had on this show was Dr. Penny Sartori, who's also associated with the AWARE project. What she did was go and interview patients who had recovered from a cardiac arrest. And she had 2 groups. One group who said they had a near-death experience, and another group who said they didn't have a near-death experience. Okay, so I went on to explain Dr. Sartori's research, but really she does a much better job of it than I do. So let me drop in the clip from episode 90 of Skeptiko, where she talks about the conclusions of her research.
What I did was the people who had a near-death experience and the out-of-body experience, what they recorded was really quite accurate. And I decided then to ask the control group, the people who'd actually had a cardiac arrest but had no recollection of anything at all, I asked them if they would reenact their resuscitation scenario and tell me what they thought that we had done to resuscitate them. And what I found was that many of the patients couldn't even guess as to what we'd done. They had no idea at all. And then some of them did make guesses, but these were based on TV hospital dramas that they'd seen. And I found that what they reported was widely inaccurate.
Okay, well, I have a couple of responses to that. First of all, even if that's the case, and I would need to look at this research, I would need to to see whether it's been corroborated, I would need to see whether it's been replicated, I would need to see the peer review about it, and that's going to take a lot longer than I can do just in a couple of minutes on the internet. But the second thing I would say is, again, even if that's the case, I don't think that that's necessarily suggestive of an immaterial soul. All that suggests to me is that some people, when they're near death, are able to perceive, their consciousness is still, it's still capable of perceiving things. In fact, what the research that I've seen is that many, many, many near-death experiences are wildly inaccurate, that people do perceive, I'm going to put in quotation marks, people do say that they perceive things that aren't really there.
I want to try and cover the 3 points that I heard you raise. And the first is that you said even if Penny Sartori's research and Bruce Grayson's research is accurate, and I hope you will follow up on that because it is peer-reviewed and it's by very well-qualified folks, but even if it is true, it doesn't mean much because maybe their brain just works differently. And what I'd bring that back to is the point that we were really on, which is that NDEs are medically inexplicable. And what I'd say is that if, as you say, they are having, their brain is working differently or their consciousness is working differently, it is very vastly differently from anything we currently understand in our medical knowledge. Because when you are experiencing cardiac arrest for 1 or 2 minutes like these folks have, your EEG is flat. And as we just said, if your EEG is flat, you're not supposed to be having any conscious experience. So if they're having some conscious experience in their brain, which is kind of your model, then that is medically inexplicable.
Okay, let's for the moment, let's concede that point. I don't actually concede that point at all. I don't concede that it's medically inexplicable. I've seen a lot of research showing lots of good explanations for why NDEs happen, and this whole thing about they're perceiving things more accurately than other people. That's the research that I've seen, and I've got it on my computer now. If you want me to cite it,
I'd be fine with pausing for however long you need. Most of the people that you cited in your blog, both on the skeptical side, GM Worley, Susan Blackmore, you didn't cite, but she's the most prominently cited skeptic. Sam Parnia, who I consider a skeptic, even though some people don't. I've interviewed all those folks just to say that I think I'm pretty familiar with the research. I haven't seen anything along the lines of what you're saying, that these people are widely inaccurate in their recollections. As a matter of fact, I think the research, and again, I'd go to Dr. Jeffrey Long, who's published a book, Evidence of the Afterlife, and he's a medical doctor and the former editor of the Journal of Near-Death Studies, which is a very fine peer-reviewed journal that publishes all sorts of research on this. But anyways, he's very qualified. And his research shows exactly the opposite. Bruce Grayson's research shows exactly the opposite. I'm not aware of any research that contradicts that.
And do you want me to give you the URL? I can give you the URL if you want. I mean, it's stuff that it's the easiest way to do it is if and this is to you as well as to anybody else listening to this. If you go to my blog, which is called Greta Christina's blog, and if you go to the piece called Why Near-Death Experiences Are a Terrible Argument for the Soul,
I went to some of those links. So I went to the first one is an article by Keith Augustine, a well-known skeptic of near-death experience. But I got to kind of jump in here. This is not research, if you will. This is, talk about anecdotal cases. He's found 1 or 2 instances of discrepancies in accounts, and he references Peter Fennick, who is a very qualified researcher. And I wouldn't dispute that there are some discrepancies in some people's accounts. And if we want to go on anecdotal evidence and one person says the shoe on the window, another person says, here's the discrepancy, or one person says, here are the dentures, as GM Worley does, and then there's a discrepancy, and the guy comes back and says, no, there really was the dentures in the box. All those are interesting, but they fall into this category of anecdotal evidence that we're trying to get out of. The best research that's been done of large groups of these people and large groups of these cases and analyzing them, like I think Jeff Long has some of the best research, really contradicts these one-off anecdotal cases. So I don't think you can really cite Keith Augustine's work. Even though he's a good writer and a good reporter, he's not really doing research per se. He's just trying to find instances of these disagreements.
Well, but that is research. If you're looking at instances, and again, I kind of feel like we're getting a little sidetracked. I want to address this point, but there's a really important point that I want to make when I finish here. But I'll go ahead and address this point. If somebody is citing research saying, look, near-death experiences are, they're really accurate. It's like people are seeing things they couldn't possibly have seen. And then somebody else says, well, actually, when you look at a lot of these cases, a lot of the things that they're supposedly perceiving weren't really that accurate. And when you look at them more carefully, they weren't really that accurate, or they could have been perceived by natural means.
See, but there's the problem. When you say a lot of times, you have to back that up with statistics. The most recent research on that I can cite for you is published by Bruce Grayson in his recent book, and I'll have to get the correct title, but it's like the encyclopedia. Okay, it's actually titled The Handbook of Near-Death Experiences, 30 Years of Investigation. And it is authored by Bruce Grayson along with Jan Holden from the University of North Texas. And by the way, here's a recent interview clip from Bruce Grayson where he talks about Jan Holden's research.
Jan Holden at the University of North Texas actually looked at 100 different published reports of these out-of-body perceptions. And she found that about 86% of these had been corroborated by somebody else. In other words, a third person also said, yes, these perceptions were accurate. In 92% of these cases, they were entirely accurate. In only 1% were they inaccurate.
So that's from an excellent interview that Bruce Grayson gave to Dean Radin, and I'll provide a link to that in the show notes. But here was Greta's response.
I'm highly skeptical of that. I'm really sorry, but it's that, and the problem is, and this is a problem, I will admit it's a problem on both sides. When you have people who are trying to grind an axe, when you have people who are there, and Bruce Grayson, I think, he wants to believe, and we have people who want to believe, their research isn't necessarily going to be that great. The methodology isn't going to be good, they're not going to be rigorous, they're not going to be doing placebo controls, they're not going to be doing, basically one set of study of 100 people done by somebody who really, really, really wants to prove their point. I need to see that replicated. I need to see that peer-reviewed. I need to see it studied by a lot of other people who aren't trying to grind an axe.
His name is Bruce Grayson. He's professor of psychiatric medicine at University of Virginia, and he's also the head of the Division of Perceptual Studies. He's one of the most well-recognized and highly thought-of NDE researchers in the world, and he doesn't have an axe to grind. There's plenty of research that corroborates what he's saying. And really, I mean, if we're going to play the kind of credential game, you really wouldn't want to stack Bruce Grayson, Jeff Long, Dr. Pin von Lommel, one of the most highly regarded cardiologists in the world who's been studying near-death experience for 30 years. You wouldn't want to stack them against Keith Augustine, who really doesn't have any kind of medical credentials. So I'm talking to you about published research in both cases, right. Peer-reviewed published research.
And here's my problem. My problem is that if your argument is basically, you seem to be making, to some extent, okay, you know what, we're actually getting sidetracked here, because there's a really important point that I want to make, and we keep getting sidetracked from it. And that's this. Let's, for the moment, concede your point. I'm not conceding it, but for the sake of argument, let's concede your point. For the sake of argument, let's say near-death experiences are medically inexplicable. I don't think that's true, but for the sake of argument, let's concede that point. The fact that something is currently inexplicable doesn't mean that your explanation for it is right. And this is, I think, a really important point that I think a lot of people, a lot of believers in all kinds of religious or spiritual or supernatural experiences say. They say, science can't explain X. Therefore, it must be God, it must be the soul, it must be this immaterial world. And that is a terrible argument. And, and this is a point that I make a lot in my blog. I make it a lot in my writing. When you look at the history of the world, you look at human history, for thousands upon thousands upon thousands of years, the history of human knowledge has been that supernatural explanations of phenomenon have consistently been replaced by natural ones. Every time we've thought that the reason for some phenomenon, the reason for thunder, the reason why people get sick, the reason why people have mental illness, the reason why children look like their parents, et cetera, all of these phenomena that we used to think were supernatural, when we investigated it more carefully, we said, oh, this is actually physical cause and effect. That's happened thousands upon thousands upon thousands of times. The number of times that it's happened the other way, where we thought that a phenomenon was physical, and then really when we looked at it carefully, the consensus among, all, careful researchers was that, yeah, this really is supernatural. It's like we thought that this was physical. We thought this was physical cause and effect, but we looked at it and, it's really not. That has never once happened.
Let me respond, because in the framework of this discussion, I don't want to respond to all of that because I think that's where we kind of get sidetracked. I agree with the main point that you're making, and that's that medically inexplicable, a gap there, doesn't mean that any one particular group has license to shove into that gap whatever their belief is. So we're in agreement on that. Now, as far as parsing out the long scale of history and whether there's ever any evidence for people changing or moving towards a supernatural explanation, I'm going to say that's really not relevant to the small confines of this discussion we had, because what we intentionally did at the beginning was say, we're just going to look at near-death experience science. And I want to do that because otherwise we could go in and talk about a lot of other fields and we could have a knockdown, drag-out, good discussion like we're having here about each one of those. So I'd agree with your first point, and then I'm going to blow past a lot of the other points you made.
I don't think it's a trivial point. I don't think it's off topic. I think it's very much relevant. This question of the looking at the history of supernatural explanations of phenomenon versus natural ones, I think that is a huge point. And I think it's a point that a lot of believers in the supernatural
Before we get too far down there, I'm fine with that. We can have if you look at my podcast, I've covered a lot of those. I mean, you want to talk about the precognition research of Dean Radin, or you want to talk about Rupert Sheldrake and his morphic resonance. All these are supernatural, or telepathy, or remote viewing. I've covered those topics, but each one would be worthy of a discussion like this. So, I can't endorse what you said, that the long history of science shows nothing that's ever been turned over and shows, I don't know. I just don't think we can really go there in this discussion. We have to confine ourselves to the near-death experience data and the research that we have, because that's what we agreed at the beginning. That's what we're looking at. We have to build bottom up from this research. And you have a certain threshold in your mind in terms of what would convince you. I have a certain threshold in my mind in terms of what would convince me, and that's fine. We can't resolve that in an hour-long discussion here. But what we can do is try the best we can to look at the evidence that we have. And I think we've kind of made some progress. I really have only one more point that I want to kind of get to, because the last point we were at least in my list, was NDEs are medically inexplicable. And you did some good what-if scenarios and trying to play that out in terms of what it might be. And we talked about some research there that we could follow up on. But my last point is this. And this is probably the largest point of disagreement that we'd have. And my position would be that based on everything we've talked about, the best evidence from NDE science suggests that somehow, in some way we don't totally understand, our consciousness survives death. So it takes this idea that they're medically inexplicable, which we didn't totally agree on, but we kind of came close to. And then I take it one step further and say, if we really look at that evidence honestly and fairly, it suggests that consciousness does survive death.
And I don't see that at all. And again, we started talking about how are we exactly defining death and what point is somebody really dead versus just very close to death. But again, it's, when you talk about somebody who's really, really close to death, who even, their brain flatlines and they're not conscious anymore, and then their brain starts working again and they become conscious, that's something that's really, really different from somebody who dies and then they're dead and they're put in the ground, and there's absolutely no evidence to suggest that those people, that consciousness in any way survives that. And again, that's one of the main points that I want to make about near-death experiences, is that they don't really, and we went over this before, but they don't really tell us that much about death. They tell us about near death.
Okay, so here we are. We've arrived at the last final question. Does near-death experience science suggest that consciousness survives death and therefore the existence of a soul? And if you're waiting for a real fight, you got it here. Here's where it starts. And I guess the fight really started with Greta's last point, because to me, if you're going to get through all this data and you're going to arrive to the point where saying, okay, I maybe have to give in a little bit, that consciousness seems to survive death for at least an hour when it shouldn't, but then you want to hold on to that and say, yeah, but you still haven't proven anything because it's only an hour. Well, that to me gets back to this thing of apologetics. It's just trying to work backwards from your cherished belief and try and find some scientific sounding explanation for it. It just really doesn't add up for me. And I expressed that to Greta, that I thought it was just apologetics. Here was her response.
My problem is that when I've gotten into these debates with people, and I've gotten into a lot of them before, there's always this thing of like, I say, well, look, you look at this piece of research that supposedly supports that near-death experiences support the idea of a immaterial soul. And then that one gets exploded, and they say, oh, but you didn't look at this other one. And I say, well, actually, and then I go look at it, I spend a few minutes,
You haven't shown me one single piece.
Can I please just finish? But my problem is that, you say, oh, you've got this, it's like I can cite you the Skeptical Inquirer, I can cite you Skeptics magazine. There's all kinds of huge amounts of research that have been done on this.
Those aren't peer-reviewed journals.
But my point is this, that every single time somebody has said, oh, but you need to go look at this, I go look it up, and I see actually it's been debunked, or the methodology isn't really that good, or the sampling size was really small, or my point is this. My point is that there's these moving goalposts. Every single time somebody says, oh, but you need to look at this other piece of evidence, and I look at that and it's not very good, and they say, oh, but you need to look at this other one, and I look at that and it's not very good. Over and over and over again, every single time I've seen research that supposedly supports this claim that consciousness is animated by the soul and that near-death experiences support that.
One piece of real near-death experience research in your blog post. I'll take that back. The one piece of real near-death experience research you cited was this study done by these Slovenian doctors that suggested that elevated CO2 levels might be correlated with near-death experience. Well, I had on Dr. Stephen Novella, who's a neurologist at Yale, and we hashed out and talked about that study. But what you'll find is that study is not at all good evidence for what you're suggesting. These people with elevated CO2 levels, they really weren't elevated. The scuba divers have higher levels of elevated CO2 levels, but even Dr. Novella, we agreed at the end that this research tells us nothing as to whether or not anything about these NDE So hold on. My point is, what you said is fine, but Greta, you got to back it up. You're saying that every time somebody gives you research, you go and look at it and it's debunked. Well, tell me what's been debunked. You haven't cited any real NDE research. You studied Keith Augustine, and then you want to cite Skeptical Inquirer and Skeptical Magazine. Those aren't peer-reviewed journals.
But they're doing the research. They're doing, and see, here's again, it's like, again, we're running low on time. I need to wind up here. My point is this, and again, we're running into this problem, and I stated at the beginning, I'm not a neurologist, I'm not a neuropsychologist, I'm not an expert in this field. I'm a layperson who's done a certain amount of reading. I may not have read the particular things that you've read, I've read other things. If you want to send me some links and we can have another conversation about this in another couple of months, and I can, and I really am sincere when I say okay, show me the evidence and I will change my mind if it's really good evidence. But again, there is a huge body of research. So first of all, there's a huge body of research showing the intense link between the physical brain and consciousness. There's this, what seems to me to be extremely shaky research, and not at all. There's no consensus about it in any sense. In fact, the overwhelming consensus among neurologists is that no, these people are. I'm not going to say crackpots. That's too strong a word, but these people are mistaken. That they're being led down by the garden path by their wishful thinking. And again, when you look at the history of thousands and thousands and thousands of years of human knowledge where supernatural explanations consistently get replaced with natural ones, and it's, ultimately, when the research has been really done and it's been really examined, it's never been the case that it's happened the other way around. I have to just assume that probably, and again, I'll say probably, it's hypothetically possible that I could be mistaken, but that probably consciousness is physical. And again, and the thing that I have to keep coming back to is even if I concede virtually every point you've made, even if I concede that, wow, it's like there's all this research into near-death experiences and it shows that really weird stuff happens and it shows that stuff happens that we really just can't explain. Again, I don't concede that point, but even if I were to concede that point, if I was to say, wow, there's all this research and it's really carefully done, it doesn't prove anything. All it proves, anything, even if I conceded everything that you'd said in this whole conversation, all that it proves is that consciousness is weird and that we don't understand it, which is a point that I, acknowledged at the very beginning of this conversation. That's all that it proves. It doesn't prove anything about there being an immaterial soul that animates consciousness, and it doesn't prove anything about that immaterial soul surviving death.
Now that's apologetics. When articles in the Skeptical Inquirer and Skeptic magazine trump original peer-reviewed research, that's apologetics. When you say this can't be true because nothing in history, thousands and thousands and thousands of years has ever happened like this, that's apologetics. I mean, it would be if it was true, but there's really no way to back up something like that. And finally, when you disparage well-qualified researchers who've run the gauntlet of publishing and standing up and facing criticism of their work, when you disparage their work and you haven't even read it, well, that's apologetics. Now, in fairness to Greta, I have to say she does just about as good a job as anyone we've had on this show. It's just that, well, she's got a hard position to take. I certainly wouldn't want to take the other side of this argument. There's no way to defend these points. There's no way to look at the data and come to the conclusion that near-death experiences can be explained by our current medical understanding of the brain and consciousness. You can't. People who experience near-death have a severely compromised brain. They shouldn't be having a conscious experience. That's medically inexplicable. And given that this conscious experience happens during a time when we'd expect them to have no consciousness, then we have to logically conclude that consciousness, in some way we don't understand, extends beyond our bodily death. Again, I don't know how you can argue the other side of that without resorting to the same kind of apologetics that Greta does. Now, actually, Greta and I left things on very good terms. I'm very happy that she came on. I thought she did a great job and a fair job of presenting her side. And she said she'd be willing to come back on once she's sorted through some of the links that I'm sending her. And I certainly want to offer her that opportunity. And I also want to extend that opportunity out to all Skeptiko listeners and readers. If you think we've missed something, if this conversation needs to be expanded in another direction that I haven't covered, contact me. Send me an email. Better yet, join the forum and post a link there. If you really have something to say, we'll find a way to get it into one of our shows. So that's going to do it for this episode of Skeptiko. If you'd like more information about this show, including several of the links we talked about, certainly a link to Greta's article and a link to that interview with Bruce Grayson, please visit the Skeptiko website. It's at skeptiko.com. Just think of skeptic, but change the C to a K-O, and you'll get there. And once you're there, you'll find a link to all our previous shows, an email, a Facebook link to me, and a link to our forum and our show comments where you can get involved and engage with other Skeptiko listeners. Have a couple of good shows coming up. Stay with me for that. And until next time, bye for now.